We good, guys? Okay. Good morning. It's with great pleasure and privilege that I sit before you today on this beautiful Wednesday morning. The time is 10:13, and I call this meeting to order. The date is February 26, 2020, and I call this meeting to order. We'll do invocation by Councilman Pete Crisp, if you would do the honor, and Pledge of Allegiance by Councilman Mr. Robert Molina, please.
Sure.
Thank you. Please rise.
Bow your heads, please. Dear Heavenly Father, we come to you today with open hearts and open minds. If you could please guide us through this day and this duty that we have before us. Please watch over those of our community and surrounding areas, and just over your children as a whole. Jesus, we pray that you lead us in the right direction to make the decisions that need to be made. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Turn and face the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Agenda item number 2, citizen comments and public announcements. It looks like we do not have citizen comments. Public announcements, Ms. Bowen?
No, not at this time. Thank you.
Mr. Crisp?
No, ma'am.
Mr. Molina?
No, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have none. Agenda item number 3, discussion with Attorney Charles Zeck regarding amendments to city charter.
Morning, council.
Good morning,
Morning.
sir.
Morning, Charles. Morning.
Morning.
So based on our previous discussions, I brought forward what you'll see. I think I sent it Monday, so I assume that you've had an opportunity to look at it. But there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, looks like six potential proposition or measures that could go on the ballot based on your discretion and your decision making. One of them has 2 possible, well, they all, quite honestly, have multiple possible outcomes because there's policy considerations in most of them. But what I've done is I've put them in measures A, B, C, D, E. There's 2 versions of measure F, and then measure G and measure H. Nope, just G. Is that right? Yeah, just G. At the top of each measure is a statement that could be used as a proposition to go on the ballot, but it's essentially a description of the changes that are taking place within the measure. And each measure will have multiple changes to your charter, but the only thing that would go on the ballot would be language similar to what you see at the top of that measure, which would be the proposition that would go on the ballot. So it'd be a for or against with the question, should the charter be amended to provide as follows. Unless you have any questions to begin with, I'll just start with measure A. And measure A would be an amendment to the city's home rule charter, amending by deletion or revision those sections which are unnecessary to the charter and create a more clear and simple home rule charter. Essentially, measure A are amendments by either revising language, adding language to it, or deleting language, or a combination thereof, with sections of the charter which are not necessary. It's either duplicative of state law, it's duplicative of other areas in the charter, it's not required to be in your charter for purposes of establishing your powers, things of that nature. I consider it to be a non-substantive change to your charter. And I'm happy to go through it with you section by section if you'd like to do that, or take questions. I'll just defer to you as to how you want to handle it.
Council, I think we're familiar, right, with what the extra verbiage that,
We're
Ms.
deleting.
Sandra, how do you feel about it? Would you like him to go into, or are you good with,
No, I'm good with that.
okay. Mr. Crisp?
No, I think A is.
Mr. Molina?
No, ma'am. I'm good.
Yeah, I think we've
Good.
beat it to a pulp already.
I realize that, and it's usually never controversial.
Yeah.
Same with measure B, which would be an amendment to the city's home rule charter, amending by deletion or revision those sections which are inconsistent with or in violation of state law. And so you do have some provisions in your charter currently that are inconsistent with state law, are unenforceable as a result of state law. And the changes that would be in Measure B would be those changes to bring your charter language into compliance with state law. The first example, I'll just go over the first one and we can go over them if you'd like, is the extension and contraction of the boundaries. The language you have in your charter is very extensive and detailed. Much of it is inconsistent with the new requirements of state law with respect to annexation. And so my recommendation would be, just as the first example, is just to delete all the requirements associated with the extension and contract and boundaries, and then add language for the purposes of contraction of your boundaries. Currently, you don't have any language in your charter that deals with the contraction of your boundaries. And state law says that you can contract your boundaries pursuant to whatever requirements you have in your charter. And since you don't have any requirements in your charter, arguably you couldn't, if you decided it was in the best interest of the community, you could not reduce or make your municipal limits any smaller. So we've added some language that basically says that whenever, in the opinion of the city council, there exists within the corporate limits territory not suitable or necessary for city purposes, you may discontinue that territory by ordinance after conducting a public hearing. So it just provides a process for in case that situation ever arises.
Right.
And so that's an example. And I'm happy to go through all of these if you'd like for me to do it.
I did notice that there was the change from the 2 years to 12 months, but it wasn't really, was it recognized in all areas as of that? Because I noticed on another one where we talked about term limits, it wasn't recognized there.
The only section where, so that's the 2 years to 12 months is the section of your charter that says how long you have to live within the city limits before you can be qualified to run.
But that's new law.
That's inconsistent with state law.
Right.
State law says the most you can
Ask for is 12 months.
12 months.
Right.
And so that's the only section where that was applicable, so that's the only section where I made that change.
That's okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Notice, I'll go ahead and point this out, a lot of folks don't know this. Notice section 9, which is on, and I apologize, there's no page numbers on the bottom of these, but it is the third page in on. Oh, good for you. Where it says street improvements, I deleted the bulk of all of that, but included language, if you'll see that inserted language that is underlined that says, and may apportion costs for improving a highway, street, or alley abutting an owner's land between the owner and the city. There's authority to do that in the statutes, but the statutes say that it has to be in your charter in order for a home rule city to be able to do that. So you may or may not want to do that in the future, but in order to have that authority, it needs to be in your charter. It's currently not in your charter, so I've included that as part of your authority.
Okay. Now, section 14, I know we talk about quorum in there.
Yes, you do. The only thing, though, that I've changed in this particular measure, it would only deal with those provisions of the section that are inconsistent with state law. So I didn't address any policy issues in here. This is simply bringing all of your provisions which are inconsistent with state law into compliance. And that section would be the section that deals with holding a uniform election date in May or other times as may be authorized. Because as you know, you can't hold an election on the first Saturday in April anymore.
Right.
Okay, I'm gonna ask a question here, and and I don't know if it falls, so John, please. We're showing here that the elections are in May, okay? What would it take, I mean, it's not just a charter change, there's actually more to it, to move the election to be a uniform date with all elections, let's say November or something like that? Because I know there was a while back when we could have actually moved it, and if I'm not
You've
mistaken, we
missed
can't.
the window to do that.
We've missed, and that's what it, yeah. Because I've been asked that. Well, you're doing charter change, why don't you move the election to November? And I'm like, well, we can't. There was a window where we could have done that.
That is
and the
correct.
city did not do it.
And you missed that window.
When was that, if you?
Oh, it was several years ago.
Yeah, it's been a while.
It's been a while, yes.
Okay.
I apologize, I just don't have it
Yeah,
memorized.
no, that's fine, that's fine, that's fine. But there was a window
There was
where
a
that
window of
opportunity
time,
existed, and it's not like
yes.
just something we can change.
That is correct. The Texas legislature has closed that opportunity.
Okay.
Okay. Good question.
Council, any questions on section B?
I have a crossover question with E, basically, right? So, and I think that you may have said it while I was reading, and I apologize. In regards to the recall process, I know that you're removing the portion that says the 5 days, which doesn't actually apply whatsoever and hasn't applied for quite a while. But do we address the process here or there where we're talking about who can actually vote on it and how it can move forward? Because in a situation where they're being recalled, they have direct conflict to voting for or against actually calling the vote. Can that be addressed, or is it already been addressed?
Well, it's been addressed in state law.
Okay.
There's a case, actually. I think it actually deals with a recall, where the courts have held that when you have a direct interest in the outcome, that you have a conflict of interest on the vote and you can't vote. So it's been addressed in state law. I mean, if you'd like to address it in the charter, I suppose you could, but
That did become an issue and in conflict of interest that we did deal with 2 members being recalled, and then they were allowed to vote on their date of
Yeah,
recall election.
my recollection is that state law would prohibit. I mean, sure, it can happen and it'll play out how it plays out. But I believe there was a situation, and again, I've been doing this for 20 years, so I don't know what I've forgotten, what I've remembered, and where it
Gotcha.
says. But my recollection is there was actually a case. It was actually it was either a recall case or a removal case, where a city council was voting on the removal of a particular the mayor or council member from the charter. But I believe it was a recall, and it was whether or not to put it on the ballot for consideration. And the court and the individual at that time voted not to put it on the ballot, and there may have been 2 of them. And as a result, it didn't go on the ballot.
Oh, wow.
And so someone challenged that, and the court held that they were conflicted from being able to vote. And it was a ministerial obligation anyway
Right.
to place it on the ballot once the petition requirements had been met.
I feel like that would be just to put it in there, and
But
that way we don't have to.
We would do that separate. We wouldn't do that.
Yeah, because
I wouldn't recommend we do that here.
I've got, and the reason why, and I understand the reason why David went ahead and allowed and said that there was a conflict is because the statute in the recall specifically would have set the election at a certain period of time. And so he's like, doesn't matter. If my recollection is correct when he gave that opinion. I didn't.
weren't you here at that time?
I know, but.
And remember, I'm just going off my memory,
But
all
when
right?
you all
So
set the date for the recall, David was still the city attorney, and that David was the one that gave you all the opinion for it, the dates as to how we did the recall. I just followed David's dates, and they were set by statute. So, I mean, I had questions.
You could have sworn you were on there, John.
I was here when the recall occurred, there's no doubt about it, but when you all set the dates for the recall, David was still here. But I followed David's process, but I had question in regards to just exactly what Mr.
and
said.
so long as it went on the ballot, there's no harm, quite honestly, there's no harm, no foul. You know, even
Oh,
if
but
It just drug out the
it
3 meetings. It
created-
just
It
drug
was
out the
like,
3
yeah,
meetings
for
as
that.
opposed
If
to.
you would have been here,
it
you'd
resulted
speak
in an
differently right now.
in an inconvenience. I understand, a political.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
And it would have just made it dry and clear. I mean, black and white. It
And-
would have been like,
and-
here it is.
And the removal of that section in the charter that says the 5 days, whatever, because there was a point too where they were saying, oh, you're outside of it, so it doesn't
Yeah.
matter anyway. You can't
Right.
even hold a recall election
Right.
because
Yeah,
you're outside of those dating.
We're deleting that because that's not consistent with.
Because
the
that was
state.
part of the argument too.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I'm not trying to hatch up old things. I'm just literally
we're
just
trying
bringing.
to encounter,
Which is
yeah.
part of the process, absolutely, I understand.
So, but yeah, by removing that section there also, we kind of get rid of part of the defense and what happened and
Right.
saying, no, you can't even do it now because you're outside of 5 days and yada, yada, yada. So, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And any recall warrants an election. There's no appointment, correct?
And under your charter provision, you can appoint to a vacant. Well, so that you have to have an election in order to deter, so under your charter, actually under all charters, there's an opportunity for someone who is subject to a recall after the petition has been verified by the city secretary to determine it has the appropriate number of signatures. There is almost always an opportunity for the council member who is subject to the recall petition to resign from their office.
Right.
I've been doing this 20 years. It's never happened. And if that doesn't occur, then it is a quote-unquote ministerial obligation of city council to place the recall on the ballot for consideration of the citizens. If the recall is successful and the council member is removed from office, then you would fill that vacancy under your charter, as I remember it, in the same way you would fill any
Okay.
other vacancy. So it could be, currently with 2-year terms, you could do it by appointment.
And that's something that changes when you have 4-year terms.
When you have 4-year terms,
Right.
when you have 4-year terms, that if there are more than 365 days remaining, you have to have an election to fill the vacancy. If there are less than 365 days or less remaining, then you can place in your charter various options for city council to fill that vacancy. Either fill it by appointment, leave it vacant, or hold a special election. But you have some flexibility within a one-year period of time
By state law.
by state law.
Okay.
Yes.
So we wouldn't have to.
You need to
list-
put it in your charter.
Oh, we do, okay.
As to what your flexibility is, but I have, when we get to it with the 4-year term
Mm-hmm.
potential change, I have included that language in here that gives city council full flexibility to fill that vacancy in the way that they determine appropriate based on the circumstances. Because if it's a full 365 days, you're probably not gonna wanna leave that vacant. You're probably gonna wanna appoint somebody to fill that vacancy for that year. Because you're not gonna wanna hold an election, spend all that money on an
Mm-hmm. Right.
election. And then, but if there's only 45 days remaining when the vacancy occurs, well, then you may choose just to leave it vacant
Mm-hmm. Correct.
until the election. So
Right.
it gives you the flexibility based on the facts to handle it however you feel appropriate. But that'll be when we come to the term change.
Okay.
Because you do have to figure that into the 4-year terms, as
Right.
mentioned.
Okay.
Any other questions on Measure B?
No, because it looks like that's all state mandated,
Yes.
so we wouldn't, I mean, really, it's something that needs to be done. Council, any questions, Ms. Bowen? On B?
No, thank you. I'm
On,
good.
B, Mr. Crisp?
No, just a statement that I noticed here that there are some removal of boards that the state has driven, like the Board of Equalization.
Board of Equalization,
Yeah, so-
no longer,
So that the
not
removal
anything
of
that we
boards
do
has been
anymore.
pushed
that,
by the state as well.
It's all done by appraisal districts, and
Right.
so.
Mr. Molina?
No questions.
Okay. I'm sorry. Item C. I'm used to flipping the page and starting over.
So Measure C would be an amendment to the city's home rule charter providing for 4-year staggered terms. I went ahead and made the same change in C that that we would be putting in B, just to be sort of a belt and suspenders approach to that change. Since if you put it on the ballot, in my opinion, just go ahead and include the change. So you can see, what I did is under section 14, section B, I added language that says that they shall be elected by majority vote of the qualified voters of the city. And that's because once you go to terms greater than 2 years, council members have to be elected by a majority vote. And which means they have to be elected by place. You have to have place 1, place 2, place 3, and place 4. In your case, place 4, and then the mayor. And so individuals would choose to run by place, and they would be elected by majority vote. So if more than 2 people are running for a particular place, and one of those individuals did not receive a majority vote, if 2 people split the vote, 30, it was, what could it be, 40, 40, and 20, right? 2 people getting 40%, or right around there, and 1 person getting 20%. The 2 people who got 40% of the vote would have to have a runoff election. So that's part of it. The other part of it is that the transition. And you had asked, Mayor, on our telephone conference about elections every 2 years.
Right.
And this is why I don't answer those questions off the top of my head, because I'm not a mathematician. But once I sat down and did the numbers, you can do staggered terms and have an election where you are not having an election every year, but you're having an election every other year,
Right.
just like you're doing now.
Right now.
But
So
that's
you
for 4-year terms.
would be for 4-year terms.
Yeah,
So you
for
could,
four.
you couldn't do it every 2 years, but you could do it where it's consistent with the way you're doing it now.
Right.
Which is you would have an election every other year.
Yeah.
But it would still be staggered. In 1 year, 3 folks would be elected, 2 council members and the mayor. You would skip a year, and then the next year, 2 other council members will be elected.
Right.
So it would be staggered.
But the ending question I think that she had asked was 2-year terms staggered.
But it would be an election every.
But then you would have an election
Yeah.
every
single
year.
It was
That
just
is
kind of
correct.
like
Yeah, just throwing it out
just
there.
make your brain kind
Yes.
of work a little
Yes,
extra.
well, it did.
Get council a little excited.
So,
yeah,
the other thing I did, so what I did is I included a transitional section in here, you can see, that shows how you would transition into 4-year terms. All I did, I mean, there's a variety of ways you can make this happen if you decide to go this route. All I did was go mayor, place 1, place 2, place 1 and place 2, and say, all right, that, at that first election, they'll have a 4-year term, and the other 2 council members, 3 and 4, will have a 2-year term. And then, in the next election, those 2 council members with 2-year terms will come up and it will be a 4-year term. That's how you get it staggered. Now, you could draw lots, to determine how that works. I just went in order, just, for consistency. But there's a variety of ways you could make it happen. And then I changed the qualifications because since we're doing it, we might as well include that change as well. Then if you see on section 18, that's the section that I added with respect to vacancy. So now it says, in the event of a vacancy in the city council, if there are 365 days or more remaining on the term of the vacated city council office, the city council shall call a special election to fill such vacancies. That's constitutional. If there are less than 365 days remaining in the term of the vacant city council office, the city council may, by majority vote of the remaining members of city council, at its discretion, leave the office vacant, appoint a new mayor or council member to fill such vacancy, or call a special election to fill such vacancy. So that's the section that gives you the flexibility, if there's less than a year remaining on the term, on how to fill that vacancy. And really, I went through their charter, and, if you decide to put this on there, I'll double check it, but that's all I saw that we would need to change.
Okay.
If you decided to go to 4-year staggered terms. Any questions about that?
I don't. Mr. Molina, do you have
No,
questions?
I have no question.
Mr. Chris?
And just me speaking out in this instance, I've chewed this over and over and over again. And personally, it's one of those situations now where I think it's not necessarily completely broken. I think that it might be something to look at a later date, but it just it pushes a lot more things into focus for the city, including, runoff elections. And if it did go through, there's no verbiage here dictating the runoff election, or is that mandated by statute, by state?
Statute.
State
Okay.
law.
So, yeah, so,
Almost, when I am assisting in drafting brand-new charters, I usually make a statement, other than how long you have to live within the jurisdiction before you can be a candidate, and how old you have to be.
Right.
Other than those changes, the statement is usually, if they want to put a statement at all, is all elections shall be conducted pursuant to state law. Because state law dictates how we run our elections with very few changes.
Able to. Ms. Bowen, any questions on that?
Yeah, I think the vacancy terminology is great. I would like to wait on the 2-year as well. I like it the way it is, leave it alone.
I just honestly think for progression, council of the city, because currently we restart and really people start campaigning a year in advance. So really you're giving the citizens a year of dedicated work. And then we start campaigning, and there's no continuance of goals, there's no continuance of progress, there's no continuance of ways of the future from one council to the, as we've experienced always. Whereas when you have these staggered terms and 4 years, this is actual work that can be done and can progress for the future. We've noticed, and I know I'm not the only one that sees that in our city, but we see this, okay, we're going, and then we stop and restart because that year wasn't so good for the city. So then the council is to blame and mayor, and so everybody's out, and so we restart. And I know when I came into office, I was hoping to sit with goals for the future or ideas of what the council was trying to bring forward, and there was nothing. It was just, okay, restart. I just think that the citizens and people sitting up here deserve to continue on with goals and for growth of the city. I just feel like county does it like that, and their system works because people can actually get work done because somebody stays in. So say, Robert and Sandra would stay in, then that would continue. The goals would continue of the council, and we could continue moving forward. I just think the time would be now to move our city forward in a staggered term, 4-year staggered term. Do you know by chance how many home rule cities practice this?
Staggered terms?
Uh-huh.
By far the majority, over 90% of the
Over
cities in
90%,
Texas.
right? That's what I had researched. Yeah,
That,
yep.
the file that you had sent us showed it differently, I thought, in your research versus the state, the paper that you put out. I thought it showed something a little different.
No, by far, staggered
Yeah.
terms is by far.
And according to TML as well, I just
Staggered
studied
terms is
that.
by far the largest.
Yeah, because of
Very few
continuance.
cities actually hold an election where the entire council is up for election at the
Right.
same time.
It just doesn't promote growth of goals and continuance. But I did research that as well this week, that's majority. 4-year staggered terms.
I don't think, I represent 35 cities in the state of Texas as city attorney, and not one of them is set up like yours.
Right. Yep. I would really love for citizens to be able to decide on that. Okay.
Any other questions on?
Anything else, council, on this? No? Okay, sir, we can move on.
Measure D is a proposed amendment to the city's home rule charter providing for a quorum of city council in the event 3 or more vacancies occurring at the same time. So I took everything that y'all had to say regarding quorum, understanding also the history and the background associated with the problems and issues that you've had in the past, which, by the way, are not unique to the city of Alice on those types of issues. I also recognize that even if it's not unique to the city of Alice, it is your issue, and you have to, ones who have to deal with it. But I just thought through how to best solve the problem that I heard occurring, and over what I heard was, if there's a recall, and we're down to less than a quorum, we can't conduct business. And we want to, as a governing body, you can still conduct business as a city because you have a city manager, and the city manager will continue to operate the city. But from a legislative standpoint, there's no legislative body for a period of time. And that wasn't something you were interested in happening. And so as I thought through that, I thought, well, let's just focus on solving that issue. And my proposed solution would be to add language as follows. In the event the numbers of city councils shall be reduced to a number of less than 3, because that's your quorum, then the remaining members of city council shall order a special election to be held on the next available uniform election date for purposes of filling the vacancies. For purposes of this section only, should the mayor be one of the remaining members of the city council, then the mayor shall have the right to vote in the ordering of the election to fill the vacancies. Now, what this would do is it would say that, okay, let's say your elections are in May, and if you have a recall election in an off year, right, then you could potentially have vacancies, well, I guess through November, right? So this would allow you to order that election. I'm not sure how to handle this, other than making it very clear that you have the authority to order the election on the very next uniform election date for purposes of filling those vacancies. The problem in my head that I ran into as I was thinking through this was always, or you could also appoint. I guess we could do that as well, because you're 2-year terms. So you could include in here language that says the authority to appoint like a single individual to make the quorum, because I'm not sure how your community would feel about one or two people,
Correct.
appointing a majority of the governing body, but maybe appointing the appropriate number of people to make the quorum. That's also a possibility. I didn't put it in here, but wanted to make sure you knew that that was a possibility. Otherwise, you get down to a situation where if you were wanting to continue to operate as a legislative body without an at least 3 folks, then you potentially have 1 or 2 people making all your legislative decisions
Right.
for the community. Which in my mind is a really bad policy decision, but it's not my policy. It's your policy. And y'all would know better than I whether or not you believe your citizens would be comfortable with, because if you recall 4 people, that leaves 1,
Right.
right? If you recall 3, that leaves 2. So y'all would know better than I whether or not your community would be comfortable with 1 or 2 people making major decisions for the city.
And I completely understand. And on the other side of things, we don't have the governing body to adopt resolutions that allow for us to continue to apply for grants. Yes, the business can continue, but we also lose the ability for some of the business to continue, because we have to have resolutions for the majority of our grant applications, and we lose that ability.
I think that's why the limited scope on the appointment of another person to fulfill a quorum
Right.
is probably the safe thing to do, to say, you can only transact business for this one item.
See, but-
If you're under the 3 people.
And you get back into that same decision of, well, if you say 1 or 2 people are appointing somebody, right? Basically, you hope that everybody has an open mind and appoint somebody that's going to be, not just somebody that's going to agree with them the whole time, right? Because you're in the same exact situation, so.
In my experience, that's not
That
what happens.
happens anyways.
That-
Yeah, I know, but I'm
that-
just saying, like, you can hope for it, but it's just one of those situations.
I mean, that said,
But
if
the
you-
way it's written, the way you wrote it, this would solve,
But it pushes it to an election.
pushes it to an election. Now,
Right.
the middle ground is that you appoint 1 person.
Mm-hmm.
That person fills that, or if it's, then you have to decide, well, what if it's a recall of 4? What do you want to do? You know what I mean? So there's just so many different scenarios that we have to sort of think through. But let's just assume it's 2. They could appoint that person to fill a vacancy until the next uniform election date, and then also mandate that the city council order an election to fill the remainder of the vacancies and that
That one.
one that was just filled.
yeah.
That way, the person that's appointed sort of solves the issue of
Yeah.
just human nature, right?
Right.
Appointing someone who agrees with our philosophies and our
Exactly.
positions, because they would only be in place for about 6 months, right? Depending on, or less,
Right.
because that's about how much time we have between uniform election dates. And then, so you could accomplish the things that you're concerned about, making
Right.
sure we adopt these resolutions, if necessary, continue sort of the major legislative things that need to be accomplished by the city. And then that person who is appointed would still, they could run for the seat or not, and then the other seats would be filled by,
Right.
could be filled by.
I think that would be a perfect scenario, as perfect as we could be in a situation that would get to that.
There are just lots of different, everybody needs to understand, there's just, the language like that still could create weird situations that we haven't thought through.
Just depending on
fully,
numbers.
Depending on
Mhm.
when the recall happens.
Yeah.
Well, and then we don't even have to specifically state recall, because look at what happened in Crystal City, where they came in and they removed every single member of council except for 1 person. You know what I mean? And then you're in a completely different situation.
I have had the privilege of actually serving as a city attorney for a city that recalled 5 of their 7 city council members. And so that city council, and no offense to the city council, but it was the smoothest that city had ever operated, ever. But that said, the city manager knew that there was a potential that those 5 council members could be recalled, or some portion of them, reducing it to less than a quorum to be able to conduct business. And so the city manager, recognizing that that was a potential problem, they actually had grant issues going on. And so she made sure she got those, is a female city manager, made sure she got the resolutions adopted, made sure she got all the grant stuff in line, did everything possible, knowing that she could be without a governing body from, it would have been November to May, and just made sure things were in place in
Right.
case it happened. It did happen, and, you know, honestly, the city ran smooth as silk. But it necessitated the city manager being able to properly plan and
And to recognize
forecast and,
that.
and to recognize that it could be an issue and get things accomplished.
Right.
So it's not always gonna be the, you know, the dire circumstances you might think. Maybe it would be, but in my one experience, it was
Yeah.
pretty smooth. But
We have looking forward, so we, on the potential agenda items that we have for the next 2 or 3 months, and working with grants and working with finance, we know what's gonna be there, and they take their time, but, we could
Approve it
bring
beforehand,
some
yeah.
forward, you know, if we needed to bring 3 or 4 grants that Barbara's working on at
Yeah.
the next meeting, you know,
Because you usually know deadlines a year in advance.
there's just some of those that happen where you get notification, and then they need it, you know, within 45 days or something
Right.
like that. Those are the few that could happen, but for the most part,
Or when they say, your application has gone in, now you have to add the application number to the resolution, and we have to adopt another resolution or amend it with the application
Amend it,
number,
yeah.
so. But yeah, no, and that's what's just a situation. there, so.
sure, absolutely. These are all issues that you have to be, you know, think about, deal with, and determine on how you want to handle.
So I think,
So what if you just didn't do a number? In the event the numbers of city council shall be reduced to the minimum of 1,
or less than 3
and then
is-
you create number of less than 3, then the remaining members of city council shall. Yeah, I guess that covers it, right? Even if it went to 1. So
Right,
then
I
your
mean-
issue is not an issue.
And we could add, like I
it covers
said, we
it.
could, the middle ground is adding the language that authorizes the appointment of the appropriate number to make the quorum, but they only serve until,
Bingo.
Love that.
Yeah, because then you would, because at
I
one,
need
Wait
to
to
add.
hear that.
at one point, we had talked about, well, we just remove what's in the parentheses there, what is it, being three members
yeah.
of council, but that causes that thing, like you said, where, okay, you only have 2 council members now plus the mayor. Now you have 2 people running the city, and this actually gets away from that.
I really like the way Mr. Zick explained.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yes.
Like it too.
All right, so I'll draft some language, if that's, everyone comfortable with
Yes.
that?
Yes,
If-
sir. Mhm.
okay.
Can you repeat that, please?
So I would include language that gives the remaining members of council the right to appoint a sufficient number to make a quorum, and then a requirement that an election be ordered for the next uniform election date, to fill the remaining vacancies and the 2 places where the people were appointed.
Perfect. Mm-hmm.
And any appointments.
That's correct.
Yes, that's what I said.
All right.
So those 2 or however many appointed would go back to an election and
That's correct.
could run if they wanted to and not just sit like it's been done in the past. Perfect. Very good.
Measure E, an amendment would be an amendment to the city's home rule charter providing for a prohibition on running for office after recall. This is easy to do. It's just a policy decision on sit-out time. So I included language that says that where I put it is in the qualifications for office, because that's what we're talking about, is someone qualified to run for office. So as part of the qualifications for office, I include language that says, shall not have been recalled within 2 years of the first day of the term to be filled at the election or on the date of appointment as applicable. This would cover both someone who is wants to run to be elected, or someone who wants to be appointed to a particular vacancy. And so essentially, if there was if you were recalled from office, you would be limited, you could not be appointed or elected to that office for a period of 2 years. It's a 2-year sit-out.
Mr. Zach, how about using, and I really like what you said over the telephone. I still have issues with specifically stating recall, but you said removed. When we were talking about it on the phone, and there's many reasons why you can be removed from office. You can be
course.
removed for recall, you can be removed, I mean, and so it's more general.
Then recall?
Well, yeah, because of the if you were convicted of a felony, you're removed from office. Do we
Right,
want
but
that
then
person-
you're ineligible to run forever.
Ineligible to run, but not removed.
Yeah, I'm not
Sadly.
yeah. There are charter provisions that actually provide removal provisions where council has the authority to remove individual
Yeah, it says
council.
no, you're
They do.
removed.
They have the ability to immediately for failure to attend meetings.
Oh, do they? Okay, then removal may be if that's the direction, removal may be the more appropriate verbiage to use.
I'm just suggesting that because I like what you said.
So good on that one, council?
I don't know if you wanted me, if we wanted to change the word recall to removal so it broadens it, because that would broaden
Removed.
it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Can you say or no?
it just
'Cause
opens it
it's
up
the same.
to any removal.
Removal will cover recall. Mhm.
However y'all want to do it.
Okay.
Less words to read. Probably better.
So the next one is F. This is the term limit provision. F01, it adds a section D to number selection form, and then I just put term limits in the same section. No current or future councilman shall serve more than 2 consecutive terms of office, nor more than 4 terms of, and all these numbers are just numbers I plugged in, so, these are policy decisions, so. Nor more than 4 terms of office during a lifetime. No councilman shall be eligible to take office for a period of 2 years from the end of a second consecutive term of office. So there's a sit-out for someone who has had 2 consecutive terms. In the office of mayor, no current or future elected mayor shall serve more than 2 terms of office in a lifetime. Years or time of service that an individual serve in filling an unexpired term or serving only a partial term of office of less than 2 years shall not be counted toward the above limitations. And then finally, time served in office. Time served in the office of councilman or the office of mayor do not count towards the term limits of the other. So the way this is, and this is a lot of policy in this one statement that y'all need to sort of think through and debate. But the way it's set up is that councilmen can't serve more than 2 consecutive terms without sitting out for 2 years. And then they could serve 2 more terms and they would be done. They would be done for life. The mayor, position of mayor, could only serve 2 terms, the way this is drafted. But you could serve a total of 4 terms as a councilman and 2 terms as a mayor, 2 separate offices, right? And then the other policy issue is how do you deal with years or time of service if it's less than a full term? Does that count towards your term limits? And the way this is drafted is it does not, all right? That's F01. That's treating the mayor and the councilman separately, 2 separate offices, office of mayor, office of councilman. F02 treats the mayor and the councilman as one office. So regardless of whether you're serving as the mayor or you're serving as a councilman, the limitations would be the same across in times of service as mayor would count as time and service on council, period.
I like
We
that
don't-
one
We
better.
don't differentiate between mayor and
Yeah.
councilman.
I think
And that's the
that
difference
serves
between
better.
the 2.
Yeah.
But all those numbers, the number of terms, the how long you have, all of that is all policy driven. And I do not want you to get the impression that I'm telling you this is, the right policy for your community. I needed to plug some numbers in and these are quite honestly, for a city with 2-year terms, these are pretty pretty common numbers.
Oh, really? Because
Yeah.
I was gonna say, I feel like these should only take effect if it goes into a 4-year term. Because
Ah.
otherwise, you know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
otherwise, you're limiting somebody to running only 4 years, and then they gotta sit out for 2 years, and they can only run 4, you know what I mean? And they can only serve for 4 more years.
It's a really weird situation. So cities that want term limits, they want short-term limits.
Right.
They either want short-term limits or they don't want term limits at all. There's no like in between where, okay, you can serve 20 years and then you're out. You know what I mean? It's either short-term limits or no term limits. There doesn't seem to be any in between there. But that doesn't mean that's not what this community would like to see.
I like F02. It just kind of makes it simple to read and understand.
Oh, the other, yeah, okay, never mind. The other thing this does is it's retro. It doesn't apply to any service that you have served in the past,
Right.
all right? So,
Moving forward.
moving
if it were
moving
elected.
forward, yes,
Mhm.
it's not retroactive. Your previous terms don't count towards your term limits.
Right.
See, and another thing too is if we did do the 4-year
prospective.
shift with this 2-year provision, right? It would say that whomever the first 2 council members, they get the 2 years, that's legitimately a full term for what you would,
Right.
what would count against your term limits, even though you've only served a 2-year term limit.
I don't think I understand, I don't think I
No.
So,
understand.
so on this first election,
Mhm.
if we were to switch over to 4-year terms, there's 2 members of council that'll only be serving 2 years.
Well, we could, so there's ways of
Now-
dealing.
now you know where I'm going
Yeah,
with it,
I know
right?
exactly where you're going. There are ways of dealing with that. And the main way to deal with it is you would include this as, if you wanted to do staggered terms and term limits, we would have one term limit that, as if you were a 2-year terms. And then for your 4-year staggered terms, if you wanted that to go on the ballot, we would include term limits in that as well.
No, I gotta-
That's one possibility. And then in that language, we would say, serve no more than 2 4-year terms. So any 2-year term
Right.
wouldn't even count.
That's right.
Another possibility would, yeah, that's probably the best way that we would handle it. And then we would have some language in the ordinance that you've adopted that says that, that the term limit sections of this one, and do not go into effect if this 4-year staggered terms is adopted by the citizens. So I've done that multiple times, where the approval or failure, the approval of one is dependent upon how another one goes.
Who was it, historically, John? Am I-
Are we out of quorum because she stepped out?
Yeah,
Okay.
we just have to stop.
Right.
We'll take
Okay,
a-
so at this time, we're going to take a little 5-minute break.
All right.
The time is now 11:02, and we will take a 5-minute break.
I don't know what she, I'd say if she's here, yeah, we can open the door and whatnot, but I think
She can hear from the restroom.
Robert, do you want a Coke or anything?
Fine, thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, John?
all right, thank you.
Thank you, Odie.
Are we still online?
Yes. Oh,
Can he pause it?
5 minutes.
Time is 11:08. Thank you for the small break. And I call this meeting back to order, into order.
So we were discussing the term limits and how, or if you wanted to deal with the term limits.
I like F.02 because it kind of is basic and it kind of covers in a very simple fashion. I'm just not a fan of any career politician, so whether you're whatever chair you are, from president down to us. Mr. Molina, any input?
No questions.
Mr. Crisp?
The only, like my statement earlier, the only reason I would see something like this being needed to take into effect is if we switch to a 4-year term.
But he already figured, right? You figured the verbiage if we would do.
If you wanted to go to 4-year terms, we could include that language in.
But I'm saying the only reason I would even.
Oh,
put
right.
this
Yes, yes.
into effect is
I
if
see
we
what
go
you're
to a
saying.
4-year term. So, because we haven't seen very long longevity, with the exception of.
Yeah, we have, in ours. Mm-hmm.
With, we had one mayor who ran, which would have hit the term limit, and then Mr. Esparza, and that's really kind of it. And Mr. Esparza wouldn't have even hit term limit.
You, Ron,
I'm only at 4 years.
but if we were already in effect.
Okay, yeah, so at 2 years, so then you're only having somebody come through 2 years, 4 years, and then they're out. So you're getting rid of the idea of the continuity that we're trying to push forward.
What do you mean? No, because you have 2 terms.
That's what I'm saying.
So it's really, if we went to 4, it'd be 8.
Yeah, but I'm saying at 2 years, you're only giving somebody 4 years of service. So the reason I'm
Right,
saying
right.
is that this only really should push effect if we go to 4 years. If we stay at a 2-year term, that this would cut everybody's continuity off. If we're at a 2-year term and we only get 2 terms, you only serve 4 years.
You only get served 4 years.
How many years were you in, Michael?
11 or
13?
12. I think 11 or 12, something like that.
Horrible, man.
Too many.
Horrible.
Too many.
Would have been on,
I truly believe in term limits. I'm sorry.
you know, in the last, I think, I don't even think, trying to think of who would have hit that. I mean, in the past, before me, maybe.
Mayor,
Mayor
Mr.
Figueroa.
Fig, Mr. Fig hit it. He was like 20-something years. Yeah.
So,
And you just never, I mean, I just like the idea of term limits. But I see your point, like if we stayed at the 2, but I feel that the citizens would approve of 4. And then that'd be 8. Which is a very long time.
Any direction on this, or are we just gonna leave it live for now and deal with it later?
yeah, I think we could chew on it more and go
Yeah.
through it.
You have
But I
plenty of
think
time.
between F1 and F2, I feel that F2 would be better because it's clear and simple, treats
them
all
on both.
offices the same. Instead of all the extra, the mayor is separate and the council is separate, because then it gives that
Additional years.
additional. So between the 2 that we have in front of us, I like the F02. That's just me.
Well, additionally, what F1 actually does is it allows the mayor to serve their 8 years.
And then go back and do more.
Then very next election,
Yeah.
they can run for council member without being
Which
out of
that's 8,
office.
9, 10, 11, that's 11, 12
That'd be
years.
a 12-year term,
That's too much.
because they'll just be switching between the 2.
Mm-hmm.
Or a council member can run for mayor.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, yes, yeah,
After
so
the-
that's why you have
after
to be
the two
clear, I mean, I've dealt with this on multiple occasions with respect to, you just have to be very clear when you deal with term limits, with respect to time of service, with
Yep.
respect to, you know, is it for the whole council, is it by place? I mean, you just have to be very clear, because, there are folks who will try to game the system,
Yes,
so we just have to be clear.
and that's my
I'm
concern.
sure those folks don't exist in the city of Alice.
Yeah, no,
No.
not at all.
I'd like to go back to D real quick, because I didn't mention it, because I wanted to talk to John first, and I meant to talk to him before the meeting, and I had forgotten. So, real quick, under D, under the quorum, if you'll see that, the second sentence, you'll see that I struck out duly elected. I wondered if whether or not that was an issue. John says there's been some confusion about that. An argument could be made that if you are appointed, you don't you don't get to count towards the quorum because it says duly elected. And if
Right.
you are appointed, you are not duly elected.
Right.
And so I would recommend striking that.
Sure. Yeah, and I think, and that's where you started talking about adding the appointment, and I'm like, okay, I looked back and you already had it striked
Yeah.
out, so.
And if this isn't something you want to place on the ballot, I believe this is something you could put on separately if you wanted to as well, just to make clear that this is an issue that we're trying to clear up. So, for discussion later. Measure G is the, pretty straightforward, an amendment deleting sections related to the Public Recreation Board. I drafted this to make clear that we're not getting rid of the Public Recreation Board. We're simply giving we're asking the city council to adopt that recreation board by ordinance. And so we would strike all the provisions related to the Public Recreation Board, but add language that says the city council is hereby authorized to create a Public Recreation Board by ordinance. Any questions or concerns with that?
I think that's plain and simple.
Pretty straightforward.
Pretty straightforward.
Easy.
Like you said, we're not getting rid of it, we're just trying to,
Make it by ordinance.
Yeah, I wanted to make that perfectly clear. And then finally, Measure H would be an amendment to the city's home rule charter providing the mayor the right to vote on all matters before the city council. And so there's some language in section 14 and section 17 that would need to be cleared up. I believe I caught everything in there, but if this is something that you decide you do want to put on the ballot, I would do a more thorough, just drill down, but I believe this captures it, just to make sure we don't miss anything.
Do you know how many, since you have so much experience in this, is this common or is it not common?
It's fairly, I would say it's fairly equal. I mean, if you think about every general law city in the state of Texas, the mayor votes only in
Mayor
the case of a
votes.
tie, right? Oftentimes, when cities go from a general law type A city to a home rule, they just simply adopt the same similar form of government that they had when they were general law, which means that they keep the same council members, and the mayor 5 council members, and the mayor only votes in the case of a tie. So that's usually how that plays out, and it stays that way until somebody decides, until somebody decides that the mayor needs to start taking responsibility for their positions.
Right.
And being on the record with their vote. That's
Right.
usually how it gets kicked out there and placed on the ballot. But I don't have it.
Oddly as it seems, that's why I would like it, because history has shown that the mayor isn't accountable and isn't transparent because they don't have to vote. And I'm very transparent and very accountable, probably to a fault. So, I mean, but I'm trying to place things in effect for the future, not for myself, by changing a charter, because I may not be here next year or the year after, but the mayor that would sit in this place, I would expect that they would be transparent, simply because I know what the job entails now and being in this chair, and you should be transparent to your citizens, and you should let your citizens know where you stand, because the mayor is oftentimes a big part of what comes to this table and has background knowledge into what's going on, really. I just feel it's an important thing, and I'll repeat, not for my sake, it's for the footprint we leave behind when we leave these chairs. It's for the citizens of the city, and I'm glad you said that.
So it's purely a community policy question. In a general law type A city, the major reason why, in my opinion, that a mayor only votes in the case of a tie is because the mayor is usually tasked with the day-to-day operations of the city. So they're performing administrative operations on a regular basis. And so the thought process is that you don't want your administrative officer also voting on your legislative policy decisions, except in those circumstances when we're trying to prevent a tie, which is what the legislature did. If you've got a city manager form of government, that sort of policy reason goes away. But there are other reasons why, a community would not want their mayor to vote. They want their mayor to rise above the sort of politics associated with voting and those types of things. So it's really your community and how your community feels about it and what they think the obligations of the mayor are. Is the mayor a consensus builder who should be in the background building consensus and trying to, or should they be up front with their votes? Your community, yeah,
Right.
pros and cons from a policy perspective for both.
Yeah. And I just see it as a voter, I guess. I would want to know where my mayor stands, as we all should see ourselves as citizens first. But,
And folks always ask me, well, how do other cities do this? And my answer is always, well, it's a big percentage or a small percentage or it's split. But then I always follow that up with, but it really doesn't matter. I mean.
it's your city.
It's your city. It's what works best for your community is really what you need to be thinking about.
Okay. Council, any questions on this, Ms. Bowen?
No, not at this time.
Mr. Crisp? Mr. Molina?
No questions.
Okay. Okay, well, that's H.
Yes, and that's all of them.
Council, any last minute on anything that we just went over, Mr. Esparza?
So, moving forward, Charlie, this will, at another city council meeting, a regular city council meeting, these provisions would be something that they would vote on to determine whether they're going to be on a ballot. And so
That is correct.
You'll
You
clean
could-
them up and,
We could clean them up so that it gets ballot ready, and then when it comes time to order you could vote any time to say, we want these to go on the ballot, and then when you order the election, we make sure you have all the,
Again, what's the time frame to make sure we end up on in November? Because I know we have to submit to the Attorney General and all this other stuff.
you don't have to submit anything to the Attorney General.
No, we do not.
All you have to do is order your election.
Mm-hmm.
When we went through the charter revisions last time, is that our prior interim city manager, we contacted TML, and TML gave us a list of things that we had to do. And one of those things was to have provisions reviewed by the U.S. Attorney's Office. And
Well, I can think of one reason why that would be the case.
due process issues and ballot access, or voter access and those types of things. But we didn't make any of those changes, but when we spoke to TML told us, and I think the guy was Tottle or Totten or somebody who had written some stuff for TML.
Yeah. I can think of,
Told us, well, if it doesn't deal with anything directly, do we still have to do it? And they had told us yes, but if you're giving us the legal advice that we do not, then I'll rely upon your legal advice.
yeah, you don't,
on what TML
so there was a time before the United States Supreme Court struck down those provisions of the Civil Rights Act that require pre-clearance, that we would have to pre-clear certain provisions and changes to our charter. We would have to send it to the DOJ. The United States Supreme Court struck down that provision of the act. We no longer are required to do that.
Good.
Remember, I don't know if you remember, whenever we used to do annexation and things of that nature, we used to have to pre-clear all of that stuff through the DOJ and submit everything to the DOJ. We no longer have to do that. Charter amendments would have been one of those things as well, but again, no longer a requirement under the recent, not recent anymore. It's about 10 years old probably now. We haven't had to pre-clear things.
Okay. Any other
So
questions?
just, all you would have to do is here's what you have to do.
Okay.
You have to order the election pursuant to the Texas Elections Code, 74 days, 76 days, whatever it is, before the election, order the election. You have to post notice in the paper twice within a certain time frame. It's in the statute, but that's after you order the election. And then you have to also put notice in the paper of any financial impacts, of, if any, that an amendment would have on the city's finances. Based on the ones you have here, there wouldn't.
Just the
Wouldn't be any
runoff
financial.
elections.
Yeah, the runoff elections, right, that's right. If you have
Yeah.
runoff elections, there could be a financial impact there. And that's essentially it. So you've
Okay.
got plenty of time.
Yeah. That's what we just make sure that we're.
Yes, sir, absolutely.
Council, any other questions, Mr. Molina?
So where are we at on these items here, as far as like, because I don't want some of these items on there. Like, I'm
I'm just gonna bring them back to us.
okay.
This is just a discussion.
He's gonna draft them up, then he'll bring them back, and then at a later meeting, you all will vote. And we have some time until you have to vote to call the election so we can have it in November.
You guys can chew these up for quite a while if you want to.
Now, you'll go line item and vote on provision A, do you want it on the ballot or not? Provision B, do you want it on the ballot?
Right.
And I think that chewing for us will come in the form of once you've actually finalized the
That's
wording,
correct.
and then we can chew
Oh,
on it,
okay.
and
Yes,
then
sir.
we take it.
There's
bring it
some
back up
additional
here.
language that I'm bringing back based on some direction I've had here, and then y'all can sort through that.
Okay. Very good.
Okay, that's it.
Thank you.
Mr. Chris?
No, that's mine.
Bowen? Okay, I think we are good. The time is now 11, oh, sorry, I got too called to adjourn.
So is there a motion?
Not yet. She's
Agenda
about
item number 4, adjourned and/or consider and act upon adjournment.
to- Motion to adjourn?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion stands as stated. Thank you, Mr. Zek, for your
Thank you,
time.
sir.
Time and knowledge, we appreciate it. Thank you.
Appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Time is now 11:24, this meeting is now adjourned.